My family erased me from everything. Then I found the document that changed it all. My name is Valentina Russo. I'm 36 years old. When I was 26 years old, I signed over power of attorney to my older brother Marco so that he could manage our mother's affairs while I was overseas working on a humanitarian project in East Africa. I trusted him completely. He was the eldest. He had always been the responsible one, the organized one, the one the family relied on when things needed to be managed and managed correctly. I was gone for 2 years. When I came back, my mother's house had been sold. Her investment accounts had been liquidated. A business she had built over 23 years had been transferred into a holding company I had never heard of. And my name had been removed from every document in which it had previously appeared. Not by accident. By design. I spent the next 6 years trying to understand the full shape of what had happened, to gather the documentation to prove it, and to find a way to address it without destroying what remained of a family that, in spite of everything, I was not ready to stop loving. What I found in the process was more than I had expected. More than the financial betrayal. That was real and significant, and I will tell you all of it. But underneath it was something older and more complicated. A story about who my family had been before I was old enough to understand what I was watching, and about decisions made decades before my brother made his, and about the specific way that betrayal works in families. Not with a single sudden act but through the accumulation of small choices that each seem survivable on their own and that together constitute something that is very hard to come back from. I am coming back from it. That is the reason I can tell you this story now. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you have ever trusted someone completely and discovered that trust had been used against you, I want you to know this story is for you. Let me start with my mother, Lucia Russo, because nothing else in this story is fully understandable without understanding who she was and what she had built. Lucia was born in 1953 in Palermo, Sicily. She came to the United States in 1971, at 18, with her parents and 2 younger sisters. They settled in Queens, New York, in a community that was in its way a translation of the Sicilian neighborhood they had left. The same foods, the same language in the home, the same specific density of obligation and affection that characterizes communities built by people who have moved far from their origin and are reconstructing belonging from what they carried with them. She met my father, Antonio Russo, in 1975. He was from a similar background. His parents had come from Calabria in the 1960s, and they had the specific chemistry of 2 people who recognized in each other something they had not known they were looking for. They married in 1977. My brother Marco was born in 1978. I was born in 1988, when Marco was already 10 years old. This 10-year gap is important and I will come back to it. My father died in 1994, when I was 6 years old. A heart attack. He was 41 years old. He died in the kitchen of our house in New Jersey, where my parents had moved after Marco started school, on a Tuesday morning in February. I remember very little of my father directly. I remember the weight of his hand on my head. I remember a specific laugh. I remember the smell of the coffee he made every morning in a particular way. These are fragments rather than memories, impressions rather than scenes. He is present in my life as an absence that has a specific shape and weight, and I have spent 30 years learning to carry that shape without being defined by it. My mother carried it differently. She did not remarry. She did not, as far as I ever knew, have a serious relationship after my father's death. She redirected the energy of that relationship, the energy of being loved and of loving, into 2 places: her children and her work. The work was a catering company she had started in 1987, 1 year before I was born, originally as a way to supplement my father's income and because she had been cooking at a professional level since she was 14 and she understood instinctively that there was a market for what she could do. By the time my father died, the company, which she had named Lucia's Table, a name that tells you something about her relationship between home and food, was her primary income and had been for 2 years. After his death, it became everything. Not in the unhealthy sense of someone who has buried their grief in work, or not only that. In the sense of someone who is now entirely responsible for 2 children, and who has the specific discipline of someone who came from a family that could not afford to stop. She worked. She built. By the time Marco graduated from high school in 1996, Lucia's table had 12 employees. By the time he graduated from university in 2000, it had 24. By the time I graduated from high school in 2006, it had 31 employees, a commissary kitchen, and a reputation in the tri-state area for certain kinds of large-scale event catering that was essentially unmatched. She had built something real and substantial from grief and discipline, and the specific recipes she had been making since she was 14 years old in a kitchen in Palermo. And she had done it while raising 2 children who were, in the ways that matter most, remarkably different from each other. Marco and I have thought about how to describe our relationship honestly without reducing it to the betrayal at its center, because Marco is more than what he did, and because understanding what he did requires understanding who he was before he did it. Marco was 10 years old when I was born. By the time I was forming real memories, he was a teenager, and by the time I was in elementary school, he was in university, and by the time I was in high school, he was a working adult with his own apartment and his own life. We were not close in the way of siblings who grow up together in the same house at the same time. We were more like 2 generations who share a mother. He was always, in my childhood understanding of him, the competent one. The capable one. The one who understood things, finances, logistics, adult matters, in ways that made him seem older than he was. When my mother needed something managed, a contractor for the house, a negotiation with a supplier, the paperwork for a business expansion, she called Marco. Not because she was incapable. Because she trusted him, and because the habit of trusting him had been built over many years of being right to trust him. I was different. I was the younger one, the dreamer, the one who read constantly and wanted to travel, and had the kind of restless energy that in a family of practical builders can look like irresponsibility even when it isn't. I was good with people in ways that Marco was less good. I was interested in things that could not be easily monetized or categorized. I went to university and studied international development and graduated in 2010 with a degree that my mother supported enthusiastically and that Marco found difficult to take seriously. Not unkindly. He was not unkind to me, Marco. But the specific quality of his interest in my plans and ambitions always had the quality of a parent managing a child's unrealistic expectations rather than a sibling engaging with a peer. He was 13 years older. He had built things. I was still building the idea of what I wanted to build. Our mother loved us both. She loved us differently. Not more or less. Differently. Marco she relied on and respected in the way of someone who sees a practical competence that they trust completely. Me she delighted in the specific way of someone who sees in a younger person something that she herself had had to suppress in order to build what she built. The curiosity, the openness, the willingness to try things that were not guaranteed. She talked about this once, when I was in my mid-20s and we were sitting in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. She said, "Marco will always be fine. He knows how to be fine. You are the one I watch to see where you will go." I told her I was not sure that was a compliment. She laughed. "It is the best kind," she said. In 2013, when I was 25, I was recruited by an international nonprofit that was expanding its operations in East Africa. A nutrition program specifically, working in partnership with local organizations to address food security in regions where conventional development approaches had not been sufficiently effective. It was exactly the kind of work I had trained for and had spent 3 years preparing for. I said yes without hesitation. There were practical matters to address before I left. I would be gone for 2 years. I had a small apartment in Brooklyn that I could sublet. I had a car I could sell. These things were straightforward. My mother had, during the previous year, been experiencing health issues. Nothing immediately life-threatening. She had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and was managing it, but the management was more complex than the word managing suggests. Her doctors wanted her monitored. There were medication adjustments. There were periods of fatigue that affected her capacity to manage Lucia's table with the full attention she had always given it. She needed someone to be in charge of things while I was away. She had been in charge of things her entire adult life and she did not like needing someone else to be in charge of things, but she was practical about the reality. The natural choice was Marco. Marco was 50 years old in 2013. He had spent his career in finance, working at a bank, then at a private equity firm, then as an independent financial consultant. He understood numbers and structures and legal instruments. He had been helping my mother with the financial aspects of Lucia's table for years, informally, looking over contracts, offering advice. He was the logical person to formalize that role while I was away. My mother asked him. He agreed. The documents were prepared by her attorney, a woman named Carolyn Marsh who had handled my mother's affairs for 15 years. The power of attorney named Marco as my mother's agent for financial and business matters. It was structured with what appeared to be appropriate limitations and oversight. I read the document before I signed anything. I am telling you this because I want to be clear, I was not careless. I am an educated person who understood the basic concept of what I was reading. The document appeared to be what it was described as. I had no reason to doubt that. I left for Nairobi in September 2013. I want to tell you about the 2 years I was in Kenya, not to delay the story but because those years are part of it. Because the person who came back was different from the person who left, and because the difference matters to what came after. The work was hard in ways I had expected and hard in ways I had not. The expected hardness was logistical, operating in an environment with unreliable infrastructure, working with communities that had historical reasons to be cautious about outside organizations, navigating the specific bureaucratic complexity of international development work. I had trained for this. I could handle it. The unexpected hardness was something else. It was the specific education of being, for the first time in my life, genuinely outside my own context. Not just geographically, philosophically. The assumptions I had built about how the world works, about what matters and what is legitimate and what constitutes success, were not universally shared, and being in a place where they were not shared revealed them as assumptions rather than facts in a way that was uncomfortable and ultimately very valuable. I came back from Kenya with different priorities than I had left with. More patient with difficulty. More skeptical of efficiency for its own sake. More interested in the quality of what was being built than in the speed. More aware of the specific ways that systems, including family systems, shape what is possible for the people inside them. I called my mother from Kenya twice a week. Every Wednesday and every Sunday. She told me about the business. About the employees. About the contracts she was managing and the clients she was developing. She told me about her health, which was being managed, and about Marco, who was in regular contact and was handling things. She sounded fine. She sounded like herself. I had no reason to look for what I was not being shown. I came back to New York in September 2015. The first thing I noticed when I walked into my mother's house in New Jersey was that something had changed in its atmosphere. Not anything I could immediately identify. The furniture was the same. The kitchen was the kitchen I had grown up in. The particular smell of the house was still the smell of that house. But there was a quality to it that was different. A sense of something recently reorganized in a way that had not quite settled. I told myself I was jet-lagged. I told myself I had been away for 2 years and that everything would feel slightly unfamiliar for a few days. I told myself that what I was sensing was my own adjustment rather than something about the house. I was partly right. But only partly. My mother was at the house when I arrived. She looked thinner than I had expected. The diabetes management had continued to be complicated, and she had lost weight during the previous year that she had not mentioned on our calls. She was happy to see me in a way that had underneath it a specific quality I could not name. Not worry. Something more like relief. We had dinner together that evening. Just the two of us. Marco had apparently been invited but had other plans. We talked about Kenya, about the work, about what I was going to do next. My mother asked specific questions that told me she had been thinking about my return and my future in the way she thought about things she was invested in. I asked about Lucia's table. She was more general in her answers than she usually was. She talked about the business in broad strokes. Things have been busy, there have been some changes, we can go over the details when you've had time to settle in. The quality of these responses was not alarming in isolation. It was only later that I would understand what their vagueness had been covering. After dinner, my mother went to bed early. She was tired more quickly than she had been before I left, which I attributed to the health issues. I sat in the living room for a while, looking at the room I had grown up in, feeling the odd double quality of being in a familiar place after a significant absence, the way things are simultaneously exactly themselves and subtly changed. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep well that night. The first indication that something was wrong came 4 days after I arrived. I had been going through the mail that had accumulated at my mother's house during my absence, redirected from my Brooklyn apartment, which I had not returned to yet. Among the mail was a statement from a brokerage account I had had since university. A modest account, savings I had accumulated in my 20s, not large, but real. The balance showed 0. I checked the transaction history. In January 2015, the account had been transferred to a different institution under a different account number. The transfer had been authorized by a power of attorney. I called the brokerage. The transfer had been authorized, they confirmed, under the power of attorney Marco held for my mother. But my brokerage account was not part of my mother's estate, it was mine. The power of attorney for my mother did not extend to my personal accounts. I said this to the representative. She said she would need to escalate the inquiry. I sat with the phone in my hand after I hung up and thought about what I had just been told. I did not say anything to my mother immediately. Not because I was not worried. I was. But because I needed to understand more before I said anything that could not be unsaid. I needed to know the shape of what had happened before I named it. I drove to Carolyn Marsh's office the following Monday. She had been my mother's attorney for 15 years. I had met her a handful of times. She was professional and careful, and I believed she was straightforward. I told her what I had found. She listened without showing much expression. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Valentina," she said, "I need to tell you some things, and I want you to hear them completely before you respond." I said okay. She told me that during the 2 years I had been away, Marco had made a series of decisions in his capacity as power of attorney agent that had gone significantly beyond what the document authorized. She told me he had sold my mother's house in New Jersey, the house my mother had lived in since 1989, and had used the proceeds to purchase a property in Florida that was held in a company he controlled. She told me he had restructured Lucia's table in ways that had effectively transferred control of the business from my mother to a holding company in which Marco was the primary shareholder. She told me the investment accounts my mother had accumulated over 30 years had been partially liquidated, and the proceeds had been moved through a series of transactions she described, in the precise language of someone who has been sitting with her own alarm for some time, as not straightforwardly traceable. She also told me that she had noticed some of these things during the process and had raised concerns directly with Marco, who had provided explanations that she had not found entirely convincing but that she had not been in a clear enough position to contest. "Why didn't you contact my mother directly?" I asked. She said she had. That my mother had told her Marco was managing things and that she trusted him. And my mother's health during this period. Her diabetes was significantly less controlled than she may have led you to believe during your calls, Carolyn said carefully. There were periods when her cognitive clarity was not at the level it had previously been. I raised this concern with her doctors, who were monitoring it. I sat with that. "You're telling me she was not fully aware of what was happening." Carolyn chose her words carefully. "I'm telling you that the environment in which these decisions were made was not ideal for the person whose interests were supposed to be protected." This was the sentence that changed everything. Not because it was a surprise. By this point in the conversation, I had understood at a gut level what had happened. But because Carolyn's willingness to say it clearly, in her office, was the first piece of documentation of something I now needed to document completely. I am going to tell you what Marco had done, in the clearest terms I can, because I think clarity is what this story requires. Over the 2 years I had been in Kenya, Marco had used the power of attorney my mother had granted him to systematically transfer her assets to himself and to entities he controlled. He had sold her house in New Jersey, the house she had lived in for 26 years, the house where my father had died, the house that had been the center of our family's life, for $840,000. The proceeds had been deposited into a company account in a company Marco owned called RMT Holdings LLC, which had been registered in Delaware in 2012, 1 year before I left. She had said that my mother was, in Dr. Park's creating a parent company, entirely capable of making and understanding decisions, and transferring the operating business of poor control during 2014. My mother had signed documents early 2015, according to the result of an adjustment period. But Carolyn's description of my mother's health during this period raised serious questions about the legal situation. The question of my mother's capacity during the period when the damaging decisions had been from my mother's investment accounts and transferred the proceeds in tranches to various accounts with her. Some of these I went to her house on a Tuesday evening in October 2015 through a series she had made intermediate steps. She cooked when she was thinking, also which was my personal brokerage account, meant she cooked incorrectly, since the power of attorney for my mother did not extend to my accounts, I did not say what I needed to say while we were $47,000. I wanted her to eat. This had been done in my name and to feel the ordinary warmth of a Tuesday dinner before I changed the shape of the evening. The total value of assets I told her I needed to talk to her about $1.4 million. She looked at me. My brother had stolen $1.4 million when she was reading a situation in 2 years being I had been building water systems and nutrition programs in Kenya. She said, I sat with this number for a long time before I could think clearly about it as it could be. I want to tell you about the period. She put down her coffee cup and sat back in her chair in the way she sat when she was about to receive something. Because that period was the most complicated of my life, she said, and because I think the complexity deserves honest description. Carolyn's conversation, the complexity, the specifics of what Marco had happened, the brokerage account, it was clearly wrong. The holding company, the complexity was about who it had been done to. I told her clearly and completely what the consequences of different courses of action would be for different people, including my mother. She did not show, my mother had been, in some sense, dramatic emotion, both the victim of what Marco had done more and, unwittingly, the specific containment of someone he had used her processing something her authority, that is too large her health for immediate reaction, to accomplish something that she had not fully understood or when consented to. She was the person most harmed by what had happened. Then she said, and also the person something was wrong. Given her health, know what to participate in the process of addressing it. She also loved I didn't Marco. Fully understand. He was her firstborn. He said he was the child she had relied on for 35 years for my benefit. The idea that he had done something like this to her, I did not know how she would process that. I did not know whether her health could sustain the weight of it. At the pasta the things I was thinking about yet when I sat in my apartment. At 30 years not my old apartment kitchen in Brooklyn, my which house, was still sublet, she said, but a temporary place. It was the first thing she said directly about in the weeks after the conversation with Carolyn. We'll address the house. I was also thinking about Peter Chung has some things I was thinking about a document that Carolyn had mentioned at the end of our conversation. You made some arrangements as an aside, Marco something she had remembered at the last moment. She looked up. She said her that my mother had changed in 2011. The other account, 2 years before I left, 3 years before things began to go wrong. I almost forgot I did that with an estate attorney about her will. She almost smiled. That this arrangement had been made privately, and that the estate attorney she had used was not Carolyn herself, but someone else. A man laid out Peter full picture whose office was my mother had established. Carolyn did not know the specifics of what my mother had arranged with Peter. The specific provisions she only knew it existed about because my mother had mentioned the accompanying documentation she had prepared that established clearly and with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about this for years. That I think will matter eventually, and her understanding of the risks she was trying to mitigate. I found Peter Chong's office in 2011 that Marco would do what Lucia Russo was a client. Had they understood at some level anything else over the phone, clearly, but they would see practical intelligence had registered the following week that a structure Peter in which was 70 years old, unchecked control over running a much smaller practice than he had had in his working years. She had created he received me in an office that smelled like old paper and good wood, and the specific stillness of someone who has stopped being busy and has made peace with that. It could not be accessed without both signatures. my mother's and mine, it turned out. The provisions also specified that if my mother's capacity was impaired in a way certified by her physician, he could tell me. The account transferred to my sole control for the purposes of her care, and without my mother's authorization, for distribution according to the specific instructions she had left. He told me that my mother had come to him in 2011 with a specific concern. What I could think of, not about Marco specifically. I didn't think she had everything at that point. I thought had Marco reason to be concerned about not that he would, but about the general structure of her estate and about what she called making sure the right things get to the right people. She had told him that she had two children who were very different. She asked that she trusted both of them carefully, but that she was aware that power within a family does not always distribute itself to have this conversation, and that she wanted certain things to be protected. What we did next took 8 months and involved 2 additional attorneys, someone with forensic and organizational, a meeting with the district attorney's office in the county where RMT had made several specific arrangements and more documentation than I had assembled in any context in my entire professional authorization. I want to walk you through the key elements, that among the arrangements the legal process is the most emotionally significant part of the story. Marco had liquidated. It is not, but a separate, because the details of what we found that she had established in 2011 of what that was held in both the forensic accountant's name with specific provisions about what could be done with it. He was 55 and under what former IRS. A man who found irregular financial flows with a specific pleasure. It was not someone who generally enjoys the work. It had been established. He went through the records Carolyn provided, the records Peter provided, and the records we subpoenaed from various financial institutions. 2015, and over the course of 3 months produced a report that documented every transfer. My mother had anticipated every movement of money from my mother's accounts to Marco's control. She had protected. The total was $1.67 million. Not immediately. Higher. I needed to think about how to approach what I was going to tell her. The additional $270,000 which come from sources I had not initially identified. About specific accounts that Marco had closed and from which he had withdrawn funds in cash in amounts that were structured to stay below reporting thresholds. A method David described with the particular terseness of someone who has seen this before and finds it intellectually sloppy as well as morally wrong. I asked her directly about my mother's cognitive capacity, the power of attorney whether she had the clarity to process difficult information, which was beyond whether there were times of day that were better than others, whether there were things I should do or not do also to forgery. Depending on how the signature on the transfer authorization had been obtained, overall cognitive the district attorney's office was good. I will not go into the full details some variability because it is ongoing in ways periods of full glycemic control was interested, but that she was not impaired in any lasting or pervasive way. The investigation is what it is. I will tell you its outcome when it has one. What I can tell you is what happened with the assets that were traceable and recoverable. The house in New Jersey had been sold. She said that my mother was in Dr. Park's creating a parent company entirely capable of making and understanding decisions and transferring the operating business poor control during 2014. My mother had signed documents early 2015, according to the result of an adjustment period. But Carolyn's description of my mother's health during this period raised serious questions about the legal situation. The question of my mother's capacity during the period when the damaging decisions had been made would be investment accounts and transferred the proceeds in tranches to various accounts with her. Some of these I went to her house on a Tuesday evening in October 2015 through a series she had made intermediate steps. She cooked when she was thinking, also which was my personal brokerage account. Meant she cooked incorrectly, since the power of attorney for my mother did not extend to my accounts, I did not say what I needed to say approximately while we were $47,000. I wanted her to eat. This had been done in my name and to feel the ordinary warmth I had not Tuesday dinner before I changed was the shape of the evening. The total value of assets I told her I needed to talk to her about $1.4 million. She looked at me. My brother had stolen $1.4 million when she was reading a situation in 2 years being I had been building water systems and nutrition programs in Kenya. She said, I sat with this number for a long time before I could think clearly about it as it could be. I want to tell you about the period. She put down her coffee cup and sat back in her chair deciding what to do about it when she was about to receive something. Because that period was the most complicated of my life. She said, and because I think the complexity deserves honest description. Carolyn's conversation, the complexity, the specifics of what had happened, the brokerage account, it was clearly wrong. The holding company, the complexity was about who it had been done to. I told her clearly and completely, and what the consequences of different courses of action would be for different people, including my mother. She did not show, my mother had been, in some sense, dramatic emotion, both the victim of what Marco had done more and, unwittingly, the specific containment of someone he had used her processing something her authority, too large her health for immediate reaction, to accomplish something that she had not fully understood or when consented to. She was the person most harmed by what had happened. Then she said, and also the person something was wrong. Given her health, know what to participate in the process of addressing it. She also loved I didn't fully understand. He was her firstborn. He said he was the child she had relied on for 35 years for my benefit. The idea that he had done something like this to her, I did not know how she would process that. I did not know whether her health could sustain the weight of it. At the pasta pot, things I was thinking about yet when I sat in my apartment. At 30 years my old apartment in Brooklyn, which was still sublet, she said, but a temporary place. It was the first thing she said directly about in the weeks after the conversation with Carolyn. We'll address the house. I was also thinking about Peter Chung has some things I was thinking about a document that Carolyn had mentioned at the end of our conversation. You made some arrangements as an aside, Marco something she had remembered at the last moment. She looked up. She said her that my mother had changed in 2011, the other account, 2 years before I left, 3 years before things began to go wrong. I almost forgot I did that with an estate attorney about her will. She almost smiled. That this arrangement had been made privately, and that the estate attorney she had used was not Carolyn herself, but someone else. A man laid out the full picture whose office was my mother had established. Carolyn did not know the specifics of what my mother had arranged with Peter. The specific provisions she only knew it existed about because my mother had mentioned the accompanying documentation she had prepared that established clearly and with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about this for years. That I think will matter eventually, and her understanding of the risks she was trying to mitigate. I found Peter Chong's office in 2011 that Marco would do what Lucia Russo was a client. Had understood at some level anything else over the phone, clearly, but they would see practical intelligence had registered the following week that a structure Peter in which was 70 years old, unchecked control over running a much smaller practice than he had had in his working years. She had created he received me in an office that smelled like old paper and good wood, and the specific stillness of someone who has stopped being busy and has made the peace with that. It could not be accessed without both signatures. My mother's and mine, it turned out. The provisions also specified that if my mother's capacity was impaired in a way certified by her physician, the account transferred to my sole control for the purposes of her care and, without my mother's authorization, for distribution according to the specific instructions she had left. He told me that my mother had come to him in 2011 with a specific concern. I thought of what I could think of, not about Marco specifically. I didn't think she had everything at that point. I thought had reason to be concerned about not that he would, but about the general structure of her protected enough, and about what she called making sure the right things get to the right people. She had told him that she had 2 children who were very different. She asked that she trusted both of them carefully, but that she was aware that power within a family does not always distribute itself have this conversation, and that she wanted certain things to be protected. What we did next took 8 months and involved 2 additional attorneys, someone with forensic and organizational, a meeting with the district attorney's office in the county where RMT Holdings LLC was registered, and more documentation than I had assembled in any context in my entire professional authorization. I want to walk you through the key elements, that among the arrangements the legal process is the most emotionally significant part that Marco had liquidated. It is not, but a separate, because the details of what we found she had established in 2011 of what that was held in both the forensic accountant's name with specific provisions about what could be done with it. He was 55, and under what former IRS. A man who found irregular financial flows with a specific pleasure. It was not someone who generally enjoys the work. It had been established. He went through the records Carolyn provided, the records Peter provided, and the records we subpoenaed from various financial institutions. 2015, and over the course of 3 months produced a report that documented every transfer. My mother had anticipated every movement of money from my mother's accounts to Marco's control. She had protected it. The total was $1.67 million. Not immediately. Higher. I needed to think about how to approach what I was going to tell her. The additional $270,000 had come from sources I had not initially identified. About specific accounts that Marco had closed and from which he had withdrawn funds in cash in amounts that were structured to stay below reporting thresholds. A method David described with particular terseness, a woman someone who has seen this before and finds it intellectually diabetes as well as morally wrong. I asked her directly about my mother's cognitive capacity, the power of attorney whether she had the clarity to process difficult information, which was beyond whether there were times of day that were better than others, whether there were things I should do or not do to protect forgery. Depending on how the signature on the transfer authorization had been obtained, overall cognitive the district attorney's office was good. I will not go into the full details some variability because it is ongoing in ways periods of poor glycemic control was interested, but that she was not impaired in any lasting or pervasive way. The investigation is what it is. I will tell you its outcome when it has one. What I can tell you is what happened with the assets that were traceable and recoverable. The house in New Jersey had been sold. The proceeds had gone to RMT Holdings. We were able to establish, through the investigation, that RMT Holdings owned the Florida property, a condominium that Marco had been using as a rental income property for 2 years. The Florida property was secured as part of the proceeding. The Lucia's table holding structure was untangled. This took 4 months and the work of an attorney who specialized in business reorganization. My mother's ownership of the business was restored, with appropriate documentation to protect that restoration from any future challenge. The business itself had not been destroyed. Marco had not dismantled it, had in fact left it largely intact as an operating entity, probably because a functioning business had more value as an asset than a closed one. It had lost some clients during the uncertainty of the transition period, but the core operations were intact. The liquidated investment accounts were partially recovered. Not fully, some money had moved in ways that made full recovery impractical. But approximately $240,000 of the liquidated funds was recovered through various channels. My personal brokerage account was fully restored. The forgery charge was the clearest and cleanest element of the legal situation, and the institution involved cooperated fully with the restoration once the documentation of fraud was presented. Net recovery: approximately $1.1 million of the $1.67 million that had been taken. The remaining $570,000 was not recovered. Some of it was in accounts that Marco had emptied before the investigation could reach them. Some was in the form of cash withdrawals that were untraceable. Some was the subject of litigation that was not yet resolved. I need to tell you about Marco, because I have been describing his actions and I have not yet told you about the conversation. There were several conversations, actually, but one that matters most. My mother insisted that she be part of the initial conversation. I did not want this. I was concerned about her health, about what the encounter might cost her. She told me that she had been managing difficult things since she was 18 years old, and that she was not going to be managed away from her own conversation with her own son. I did not argue with her. She was right. We met with Marco at the offices of the attorney we had retained, not on his territory, not on neutral territory, but on our territory, where the power dynamic was clearly structured. He came with his own attorney, which told us he already knew why he had been asked to come. He looked, when he walked in, like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was simultaneously relieved and terrified to set it down. He did not try to deny anything. That is the first thing I want to say. He could have. There were aspects of what had happened that were genuinely complicated to document, and his attorney might have advised him to contest. He did not. He sat down, looked at our attorney, and said, "What do you need from me?" What we needed from him was a full accounting. Written acknowledgement of every transfer, every action he had taken under the power of attorney and outside its scope. The accounting took several sessions. He was comprehensive in a way that I found, paradoxically, more troubling than if he had been defensive. Because comprehensiveness suggested he had thought about all of this very clearly, which meant the decisions had not been made in a fog of rationalization but with full awareness of what he was doing. At some point in the second session, my mother spoke to him directly for the first time. She said his name. Just his name. He looked at her. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since, not because it explains what he did. It does not explain what he did, but because it is the honest version of who he had become. "I convinced myself it was management," he said. "I told myself I was protecting things, making them efficient, making them organized in a way they hadn't been. I told myself you would have wanted this structure if you had understood why it made sense." My mother looked at him. "I built that business," she said. "I built it while your father was dying and while you were in school and while Valentina was growing up. I built it for 40 years. You knew that." "I know," he said. "Then why?" He didn't answer that question. "Not really." He said something about having made decisions that built on each other, each one seeming to follow from the last, until he was somewhere he had not intended to be. This may be true. I believe it is partially true. But it does not close the gap between the decision to take the first step and the 40 months of continued steps that followed. My mother looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I will not forgive you today. Maybe not for a long time. But I will not let this be the end of knowing you. Because you are my son and that does not change. But what you did does not change either. Both of those things are true. She stood up. She was finished. I want to tell you about the period after the formal proceedings, because the resolution of a legal situation does not equal the resolution of a family situation, and the gap between those two things is where a significant part of this story lies. My mother was in a different house. Not her house of 26 years, that was gone, the proceeds tied up in the legal proceedings and partly spent by Marco in the Florida property. She was in an apartment in Montclair, New Jersey, that she had rented during the proceedings and that she had decided she preferred to a house now that she was managing her health more carefully. It was smaller and it was hers and it had good light and she had brought the kitchen equipment from the New Jersey house and it smelled, after the first month, like her kitchen. She was managing Lucia's table again. Not at the level she had managed it before, not the 12-hour days of her earlier years. But actively, with the help of a manager she had trained over the previous decade and who had kept the business functioning during the worst of the uncertainty. She came in 3 days a week. She was there for the important decisions. She was not as present as she had been, but she was present in the ways that mattered. I had moved back to New York. I had taken a position at a foundation that worked in international development policy. Not field work this time, but something that built on the field experience in a different direction. She said, to Montclair, you went to Kenya every Sunday, and you came back every Sunday without exception, and you got most of it back, after and you were still sitting in my kitchen on a Tuesday evening eating pasta. We talked. That is remarkable. We watched Italian films. That is exactly she had been meaning what to he watch was for talking years. About. We went to the farmer's market on Saturday when I stayed over on Saturdays, because I think which I did more and more often as the year progressed. Specificity. We talked the $380,000 we had never talked about him, combined with the recovered assets from the legal proceedings. I learned things allowed my mother to do several things she had not been certain she would be able to do. He was and she paid off the lease on the commissary kitchen Lucia's table operated well into adulthood, a long-term lease that had been a fixed cost for 15 years, and that now, owned rather than leased, became a different kind of asset he had died. She restructured the business's operations in a way that was more sustainable given where she was in her life. It was not the only scaling down in terms of quality or reputation, but adjusting the volume to something she could manage with her current energy and about what it revealed about the family structure we had all been living inside, helped about what we had each understood and not understood in the years and its associated assets from my mother said something situation that I had thought about many times. I was named as the trustee on a Sunday, which was not a decision she made lightly, and she was making pasta the way she had made in terms every Sunday of my childhood and personal. And she said, "You are the only person I setting up those accounts with Peter that I was protecting against for yourself. I couldn't see clearly." She also, with a smaller portion of the recovery, paranoid, did something I had not expected. Accurate. She established a scholarship fund at the university I had attended. I was right in my father's name, the Antonio Russo Memorial Scholarship. For students in international development, she said. The first scholarship was awarded very hard in 2019. I was right. There have been several. What Marco was right about. He wanted you to have something specifically yours. Was that Lucia's table when she told me about structural inefficiencies? This is the same idea. Period of oversight. Something specifically before the overreach. So that the transfer do the kind of early period of the power of attorney when he had simply been doing what he had been asked to do. I thought about the letter. He had identified some supplier relationships about what it means for a person to have believed in you before you knew what you were going to be. He had implemented some tracking systems that the business manager, looking at them with fresh good ideas after the restructuring, she said, had found genuinely useful but had maintained. I tell you this not to soften what he did. This was not a decision I made because the legal proceedings will determine its consequences. It was a decision I made and I am not in a position to minimize the nature of where it was practical to live, because my mother was 77 years old, where because the Sunday visits had taught me that proximity to her was something I valued more than I had previously allowed myself to value. I rented an apartment 4 blocks from hers. He used not that same building initially. We both needed our own catastrophically badly, and we understood both that about each other part of the same truth required no discussion. The legal proceedings concluded in their main walking distance for a Sunday dinner. For a Tuesday evening, I will not give one of us calls the other specific terms come over because there are aspects still unresolved. I am still in Montclair, but the primary assets were recovered, or their recovery was secured with the specific. My mother's ownership of her business was restored and protected. Working on a project that is related to the policy work I do. The damage that had been done was significantly addressed. Though not my mother is 71 now, and is managing no longer with the pragmatic discipline she brings. The question of what he is in Lucia's my life table more broadly is one I have been sitting smaller with than for several years at its and have not fully answered. Running. My mother's approach, in twice not forgiveness now, but
she
not
is at the
permanent
important
closure
events,
either.
The
Is the
parties
one I
and
have
weddings
most
and the
resonance
corporate
with,
dinners,
though I
where the
hold
food
my
she
version
makes
of
does
it
what
differently
food
than
can
she
do
holds
at its
hers.
best.
I
Which
want
is
to
to
tell
make
you
people
about
feel
something
they are
that
in the right
happened in
place.
2019
Marco
that
is in
changed
Florida.
the way I
I
understand
have
this
heard
whole
this
story.
from various
I had
sources.
been back in New York
He is
for
not in
4
prison,
years, though the legal
situation
proceedings
produced
was largely
that I am
resolved.
not at liberty
My
to discuss
professional
fully.
life had
He is
stabilized
not
in the new
in our
position,
daily lives,
which I had found
he
genuinely
is in the
engaging.
complicated category
My
of
relationship
people who
with
have
my
done
mother
something
was
what it
serious
had
to you,
become,
and whom
deep
you are
and
not
honest
certain how
and
to
the most
hold in
present
your
relationship
ongoing
I had with
understanding of
any
yourself
family
and
member.
your family.
She called
My
me
mother
on a
speaks to
Tuesday
him
morning
occasionally.
in April, not
She said,
regularly.
I want to
not
show you
warmly.
something.
Exactly.
I went to
But the
Montclair
permanent
that
closure
evening.
she resisted in
She
that
had
conference
found,
room,
while going
the
through
statement
boxes
that
she
both
had
his
moved
being
from
her
the
son
New Jersey
and what he
house
did
and
are
had
true
not yet fully
simultaneously,
sorted, is
a
the
box of
structure
papers
within
that
which she
belongs
has
to my
continued.
father.
I observe
Letters,
this,
documents,
and I find it,
notes,
on balance,
the specific
consistent
accumulation
with
of
who
a
she
life's
is.
paperwork
She
that
does not
families
collapse
keep without
things that are
always knowing what
complicated
they have.
into something
In
simpler.
the box was a
She
letter.
holds the
My father
complication.
had written it in
I do not
1993,
speak to Marco.
1 year before
This is
he
where
died.
I am now.
It was
in
addressed to my
2024,
mother,
where
it
I
was
will
not
be
a
in
long
5
letter,
years or 10
2
years.
pages in
I
his
do not
handwriting,
know, which
I
I
had
had
not
seen in
committed
other
to
documents,
permanence,
but
in
had never
either
seen
direction.
in this quantity.
What I am
in
committed
this
to
context
is the
He
present.
had written
The
about
Tuesday
the business,
evenings,
about
the
Lucia's
farmers'
table,
market,
on
which at that point
Saturdays
had been
the
operating
specific
for 5
quality
years.
of sitting in my
He had
mother's
written
kitchen
about
while
what
she
he
makes
saw
something
when he
and
watched her
telling
run
her
it,
what happened
the
during the
specific
week
discipline,
and hearing what
the
happened
standard
during
she
hers.
held, the
My
way she
father
had
wrote
built
that
it from nothing
Valentina
into
will go
something
somewhere
real.
we can't predict,
He had written
and
that
she
he
will
was
do it
proud
her
in a
own
way
way.
that went beyond
I
the
have been to
ordinary
Kenya,
meaning of
and
that
I have
word,
been to a
that
courtroom,
he found
and I
what
have
she
been
had
to a
done
conference room
genuinely
where I watched
remarkable,
my brother
and that he
acknowledge
wanted
what he
her
had
to
done,
know that
and
he
I
saw
have been
it,
to a
that
kitchen
he
where
was
my
not
mother
simply
made
a
pasta
bystander
on a
to her
Tuesday
building,
evening
but an
after one of the
attentive
worst
witness.
years of our
And
family's
then
life.
he had written
I am going
something
places
specific
I
about
cannot
his children.
predict.
He
I
had
am doing
written,
it my own
Marco
way.
will always
There are things
find
I
his
want to
way.
say before I
He
finish,
is like me
because
in
this
some
story
ways,
has been partly about
practical,
betrayal
organized,
and partly about
knows what he
recovery,
needs
and I
and
want
how
to
to
be
get it.
honest about both
But
without making
Valentina
either
is the
simpler
one
than
who
it
will
is.
surprise you.
The betrayal was
She
real
is the one
and significant
I stay up
and has
thinking about,
consequences that have
not
not
from
all
worry,
fully resolved.
from
$1
anticipation.
million in
She will
hard-built
go somewhere
assets
we
does
can't
not
predict,
disappear
and she will
without
do it her
lasting
own way.
effects.
And I think
A
you should
family
save
structure
something for
that has
her
been
that is
strained
specifically
does not
hers,
return to
something
what it
that
was
says,
before the
your
straining.
father believed in
Trust
what you were
that has
going to
been
do
broken
before
is
you
not
knew
fully
what it was going
rebuilt,
to be.
and the
He
attempt
had
to
died
rebuild it
7
produces
months
something
after
that is
writing
different
that
from the
letter.
original.
My
rather
mother
than
had
identical
not
to
shown
it.
it to me before.
I do not want to
She
minimize
had thought
any
about
of that
showing
by
it
putting
many
a too
times,
tidy
she
resolution
said.
on the
She
end
had
of it.
decided
What I
each
also
time
want to say
that the
is
moment
this:
wasn't
the
right.
protection my mother
She had
built
thought
in
I might read it
2011 was
differently
not
at
just
different points in
financial.
my life.
It
And
was a
she had been
statement
waiting
about
for the
how
point
she
at which I
understood her
would read it
family
most
and
clearly.
what she was trying
I
to
read
protect
it
at her kitchen table
she had
in
seen
Montclair
in
not
April
clearly,
2019,
not specifically,
25
years
and
after
she
he
had
had
done
written
what
it.
she could
I
with what
cried
she
in a
had
way
seen.
I had
The
not cried in a very long time.
$380,000
For
was
him,
important.
for the 30
The
years of
statement
not
it
knowing
made
him,
about her
for the specific
understanding
loss
was
of a
more
parent who had
important.
thought about you
She
before
was
you
not
were
passive
capable of
in her
knowing you were
own
being
story.
thought about.
She was
My mother
never
sat across
passive
from
in
me
her
and
own
let me
story.
cry, and when I was done she said, "He was right about you." I told her I had not done anything remarkable. She said,
to Montclair
"You went to Kenya
every Sunday.
and you came back
Every
and you found what
Sunday
had been
without
taken
exception,
and you got most
for
of
the
it
year
back
after
and you
the
were still
proceedings
sitting in my
concluded.
kitchen on a
We
Tuesday
cooked
evening
together.
eating pasta.
We talked.
That is remarkable.
We watched Italian
that
films
is
she had been
exactly
meaning
what
to
he
watch
was
for
talking
years.
about. We went to
I
the
am going to
farmer's
tell
market
you
on
about
Saturday
what the
when I
money
stayed
actually
over
meant,
on Saturdays,
because I think
which I
the
did
story
more and
is
more often
incomplete
as the
without
year
that
progressed.
specificity.
We talked
The
about my $380,000
we
in
had
protected
never
account,
talked about him
combined
as
with the
much as
recovered
we did that
assets from the
year.
legal
I
proceedings,
learned things about
allowed
him
my
that I
mother
had
to
not
do
known.
several things she had
Specific
not been
things,
certain
the
she would be
texture
able
of
to
who
do.
he was and
She
what
paid
their
off the
marriage had
lease
been.
on the commissary
Information
kitchen
that
Lucia's
requires a
table
child to be
operated
well
from.
into
adulthood, a long-term lease that had been a fixed cost for 15 years,
became more
and that
real
now,
to me that
owned
year
rather than
than
leased,
he had been
became a
in the
different
30
kind of
years
asset.
since he had died.
She restructured the
talked
business's
about
operations in a
Marco
way that was more sustainable
Not
given where
constantly.
she was in her life.
It was not the only
Not scaling
thing we talked
down in
about,
terms of
and
quality
neither
or
of us
reputation,
wanted it to
but
be the
adjusting the
only
volume
thing.
to something
But
she
we
could
talked
manage
about
with her
what it had
current
meant,
energy and
about
health.
what it revealed
She
about
set
the family
up a structure
trust.
we had all been
Peter
living
Chung
inside,
helped
about
structure
what
it.
we had each
The trust
understood
protected
and not
Lucia's
understood in the
table
years
and
before
its
things went
associated
wrong.
assets
My
from
mother
any
said
future
something
situation
once that
of the
I have
kind
thought
she had
about many
experienced.
times. I was
We
named
were
in
as
her
the
kitchen
trustee,
on a Sunday
which was
in the
not a
spring,
decision she
and
made
she was
lightly,
making
and
pasta
which she
the way she
explained
had
to me
made
in
it
terms
every
that were
Sunday
both
of my
practical
childhood
and personal.
And she said,
You are the
I
only
knew when I
person
was
I
setting
trust
up
to
those
want what
accounts
is
with
best for
Peter
this
that I was
and not what
protecting
is best
against
for
something
yourself.
I couldn't see
She
clearly.
also, with a
I
smaller
thought
portion
I was
of the
being
recovery,
paranoid, did something
but
I had
was
not
being
expected.
accurate.
She
I
established
want
a
you to know
scholarship
I
fund
was
at the
not
university
foolish.
I had attended
I was right
in my
about
father's
needing
name,
the protection.
Antonio Russo
I know,
Memorial
I
Scholarship,
said.
for
You
students
were right.
in international
Good,
development,
she said.
The first scholarship
Because I
was
worked
awarded
very
in
hard to make
2019.
sure I was right.
There have been several
What Marco
since.
was right about,
He wanted
in a very
you to have
specific
something
and limited
specifically
sense,
yours,
was that
she
Lucia's
said,
table
when she
had
told
some
me about
structural
it.
inefficiencies
This is
that
the
benefited
same
from his
idea.
period of oversight,
Something specifically
before the
his,
overreach, so
before
that
the
people who
transfers,
do the kind
in
of
the early
work
period
he
of the
believed
power
in
of
will
attorney
know
when
he had
name.
simply been
I
doing
thought
what he had been
about
asked
the
to do.
letter. He
He
had
had
identified
identified
some
supplier
years
relationships
about
that
what it
were
means
not
for a
optimal.
person to have
He had
believed in you before
renegotiated
you
a
knew
lease.
what you were going to
He
be.
had implemented
That's
some
a good
tracking
idea,
systems that the
I
business
said.
manager,
I have
looking at them with
occasionally
fresh
good
eyes
ideas,
after the restructuring,
she said,
had found
not
genuinely
always,
useful
but
and had maintained.
occasionally.
I
I
tell
moved
you
to
this not
Montclair
to soften
in
what he
2020.
did.
What
This was
he
not
did
a
was
decision I
serious,
made
and
because
the legal
of the family
proceedings
situation.
will determine its
It was a decision I
consequences,
made
and I am
because the
not in a
pandemic
position
changed
to
the
minimize
nature
that.
of where it was
I
practical
tell you
to
this
live,
because
and
the
because my
accurate
mother was
story is
77
not the
years
story
old,
where
and because
one
the Sunday
person is
visits had
entirely
taught me
wrong
that
and the
proximity
other
to
is
her
entirely
was something
right.
I valued
The
more than I
accurate
had
story
previously
is
allowed
more
myself to value.
complicated.
I rented
Marco
an
had
apartment
genuine
4 blocks from
competence.
hers. He used
Not in
that
the same
competence
building.
initially
We both
well,
needed
and
our
then
own spaces,
catastrophically badly.
and we understood
Both
that about
things
each
are
other
part
with a
of the same
completeness
truth
that required
about him.
no discussion.
The legal proceedings
4
concluded
blocks
in their main
walking
phase
distance for
in
a Sunday dinner
2018.
for a Tuesday
I will
evening
not
when
give
one
you
of us
the
calls
outcome
the
in
other
specific
and says
terms
come over
because there
I'm
are
making
aspects
something.
still
I am
unresolved.
still in Montclair.
But the primary assets
I am
were
there
recovered,
now,
or
at
their
the desk where
recovery
I
was
write,
secured with the specific
my mother's
quality of
ownership
New Jersey
of her
life
business
in October
was
coming through
restored
the window,
and protected.
working on a project
My
that is
brokerage
related
account
to the
was
policy
returned.
work I do,
The
and that is
damage
the
that
most
had been
engaged
done
I
was
have been
significantly
professionally in
addressed.
years. Though not
My mother
fully
is 71
undone.
now,
Marco
and is managing
no
her health
longer
with the
in
pragmatic
my daily
discipline
life.
she brings
The question
to
of what
everything.
he is in
Lucia's
my life
table
more broadly
is
one
operating,
I have been sitting
smaller
with for
than it
several
was
years
at its
and have
peak,
not fully
but
answered.
running. My
She
mother's
comes
approach,
in
not
twice a
forgiveness
week.
now,
But
she
not
is
at
at
the
the
important
closure
events,
either.
the
Is the
parties
one I
and
have
weddings
most
and the
resonance
corporate
with,
dinners
though
where
I
the
hold
food
my
she
version
makes
of it
does what
differently
food
than
can
she
do
holds
at its
hers.
best.
I
Which
want
is
to
to
tell
make
you
people
about
feel
something
they are
that
in the right
happened
place.
in 2019
Marco
that
is in
changed
Florida.
the way I
I
understand
have
this
heard
whole
this
story.
from various
I had
sources.
been back in New York
He is
for
not in
4
prison,
years,
though the legal
proceedings
proceedings
produced
produced
consequences
consequences
that
that
I
I
am
am
not
not at liberty
My
to discuss
professional
fully.
life had
He is
stabilized
not
in the new
in our
position,
daily lives,
which I had found
he is
genuinely
in the
engaging.
complicated category
My
of
relationship
people who
with
have
my
done
mother
something
was
what it
serious
had
to you,
become,
and whom
deep
you are
and
not
honest,
certain how
and
to
the most
hold
present
in your
relationship
ongoing
I had with
understanding
any
of yourself
family
and your
member.
family.
She called
My
me
mother
on a
speaks to
Tuesday
him
morning
occasionally,
in April, not
she said,
regularly.
I want to
not
show you
warmly.
something.
Exactly.
I went to
but the
Montclair
permanent
that
closure
evening.
she resisted in
She
that
had
conference
found,
room,
while going
the
through
statement
boxes
that
she
both
had
his
moved
being
from
her
the
son
New Jersey
and what he
house
did
and
are
had
true
not yet fully
simultaneously,
sorted,
is
a
the
box of
structure
papers
within
that
which she
belonged
has
to my
continued.
father.
I observed
Letters,
this,
documents,
and I find it,
notes,
on balance,
the specific
consistent
accumulation
with who
of a
she
life's
is.
paperwork
She
that
does not
families keep
collapse
without
things
always
that are
knowing what
complicated
they have
into something
in
simpler.
the box was
She
a letter.
holds the
My father
complication.
had written it in
I do not
1993
speak to Marco.
1 year before
This is
he
where
died.
I am now.
It was
in
addressed to my
2024,
mother, where
it
I
was
will
not
be
a
in
long
5
letter,
years or 10
2
years.
pages in
I
his
do not
handwriting,
know.
which
I
I
am
had
not
seen
committed
in other
to
documents,
permanence
but
in
had never
either
seen
direction.
in this quantity.
What I am
in
committed
this
to
context
is the present.
He had written
The
about
Tuesday
the business,
evenings,
about the
Lucia's
farmers'
table,
market,
on
which at
Saturdays
that point had been
the
operating
specific
for 5
quality
years.
of sitting in my
He had
mother's
written
kitchen
about
while
what
she
he
makes
saw
something
when he
and
watched
telling her
it,
what happened
the
during the
specific
week
discipline,
and hearing what
the
happened
standards
during
she
hers.
held. The
My
way she
father
had
wrote
built
that
it from nothing
Valentina
into
will go
something
somewhere
real.
we can't predict.
He had written
and
that
she
he
will
was
do it
proud
her
in a
own
way that went beyond
I
the
have been to
ordinary
Kenya,
meaning of
and
that
I have
word.
been to a courtroom,
That he found
and I
what
have been
she
to
had
a
done
conference room
genuinely
where I watched
remarkable,
my brother
and that he
acknowledge
wanted
what he
her
had
to
done,
know that
and
he
I
saw
have been
it,
to a kitchen
that he
where
was
my
not
mother
simply
made
a
pasta
bystander
on a
to her
Tuesday
building,
evening
but an
after one of the
attentive
worst
witness.
years of our
And
family's
then
life.
he had written
I am going
something
places
specific
I
about
cannot
his children.
predict.
He
I
had
am doing
written,
it my own
Marco
way.
will always
There are things
find
I
his
want to
way.
say before I
He
finish.
is like me
because
in
this
some
story
ways,
has been partly about
practical,
betrayal
organized,
partly about recovery, and I want to be honest about both, but Valentina is the one who will surprise you. The betrayal was real and significant, and has consequences that have not all fully resolved. From $1 million in hard-built assets does not disappear without lasting effects. And I think a family structure that has been strained does not return to what it was before the straining. Your father believed in what you were going to do before you knew what it was going to be. And the attempt to rebuild it produces something that is different from the original. My mother had not shown it to me before. I do not want to minimize any of that by putting a too tidy resolution on the end of it. She had decided what I also want to say that the moment wasn't right. The protection my mother built in 2011 was not just financial. My life. It was a statement about how she understood her family and what she was trying to protect at her kitchen table. She had seen Montclair in April 2019, not specifically, 25 years after she had done what she could with what she had seen. I had not cried in a very long time. For him, important. For the 30 years of not knowing about her, for the specific loss of a more important thought about you before you were capable of knowing her own story. She was
My mother
never
sat across
passive
from
in
me
her
and
own
let me
story,
cry.
and when I was done she said, "He was right about you." I told her I had not done anything remarkable. She was never passive in her own story. She had come from Palermo at 18 with nothing, and she had built a business and a family and a life, and when she sensed a vulnerability she had built a protection, and the protection had worked. I am her daughter in ways that are partly nature and partly the specific education of watching someone approach difficulty with that kind of active intelligence. I did not simply accept what had happened. I found Carolyn and Peter Chung and David Rees and the additional attorneys, and I assembled the documentation and I pursued the recovery. I did this while working and while caring for my mother, and while processing what it meant to have trusted someone completely and have been wrong. And I am still here. That is the thing that matters most, which is something Rosaria would have said, if she had been in this story, which she is not but whose spirit I borrow anyway. You are still here. That is the first thing. Everything else is next. My mother made a pot of pasta on the Sunday 2 days ago. I was at her apartment. We ate at her kitchen table, the table from the New Jersey house, which had survived everything, which was now in the Montclair apartment because it is the table we have always eaten at, and there was never any question of it going anywhere. We talked about the Foundation's upcoming cycle of scholarships. About a new client Lucia's table had been approached by. About a film she had seen earlier in the week that she had opinions about. After dinner she made coffee in the specific way she has made coffee my entire life. We sat with our coffee at the table. "Are you doing all right?" she asked. The question she has asked me every Sunday of the past 9 years. "Yes," I said. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "More than." We sat there a while longer. Then she said, "Your father would have liked this. The two of us at the table." "Yes," I said. "He would have." We finished our coffee. I drove home to my apartment 4 blocks away. I am here. We are here. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. My name is Valentina Russo. I am 36 years old. My family was betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect it. The person who had built the family protected it anyway, with a document she had made when she could see only the edge of the risk. I came home and found the document and found the attorneys and found the path back. My mother makes pasta on Sunday and coffee in the way she has always made it. My father believed in me before I knew what I was going to do. I am still finding out what I am going to do. I expect it will continue to be something he would have liked.